I'm Dr. Becky Faith from Digital Futures at Work Research Centre, where I co-lead Research Track 4 on connecting the disconnected. And it's an absolute pleasure today to be hosting this meeting with two people who've made a massive contribution to the study and the activity on digital exclusion, digital inequalities in this country. First of all, Helen, who's Helen Milner, OBE, Group Chief Executive of the Good Things Foundation, who I think I first met in Brighton when I was on the board of the Sussex Community Internet Project. But she's done incredible work over the last 15, 20 years on digital exclusion in the UK. And I can't think of anybody else who's done more, actually. And I'd like to publicly thank her for that work and the contribution she's also made to stimulating some really useful research as well. She's going to be joined by Almeidas, who's from the Royal Society of Arts, where she's the Director of Research. And they're going to be talking today about how fixing the digital divide will help the country level up. So I think you're going to be doing it in parallel. So over to you. I think you've got some slides ready to go. And then, so we're going to have a talk, I think, for 30, 40 minutes and then questions afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, and something that Becky didn't say is that Al and I worked together for quite a long time, and I went to the RSA from Good Things Foundation about 6 months ago, I think, so we still miss her, but obviously closely working with one another. So we're definitely not going to answer all of your questions, so please keep thinking as we talk through today, because we'd be really happy to have that discussion. So the vision and at Good Things Foundation is that we, sorry, Al's driving. Sorry. At Good Things Foundation is that we believe in a world where everyone benefits from digital, and we work across the UK, also in, go back one second. Also in Australia, and we're working with NGOs in Poland and Romania as well. And in the last almost 11 years now, we've supported over 4 million people. So the model that we use is that we're definitely interested in people being digitally included, e.g. they're able and they're safe online, but we also want to make sure that having that digital literacy, if you like, creates digital equality, but we're most interested in the impact that has on their lives, and we want them to use that to be happier, healthier, and better off. And the way that we do this is we work with thousands of community organisations across the country. We have a similar map for Australia, and we work with these local organisations, community centres, libraries, local charities that have some specialism such as English language or employability, workplaces, places of worship. And during the pandemic, obviously that was all remote. And before the pandemic was face-to-face, and now it's a little bit of both. And we have an online learning platform called Learn My Way. One of the things that I'm going to talk about later is how the pandemic has changed the way that we work. And really, if you think about the barriers that people face, that on the left-hand side, the 10 million people are digitally excluded. They don't have the equipment, they can't afford it. They don't know where to go for help, and they need skills. So what we do is we bring together that UK digital inclusion network with a national data bank providing free mobile data, working with Virgin Media, Vodafone and O2. And we also have a national device bank where we can provide free refurbished devices. And that's really because we believe that this needs to be a holistic offer for people who are digitally excluded, and working on one of those axes alone isn't really getting to all of those excluded people, and all of that is delivered through those thousands of local community partners.
Hi, and a seamless handover. Yeah, as Helen said, I'm Almeidas. I joined the RSA in August, and the RSA is focused on a world where everyone is able to participate in creating better futures. And we do this through uniting people and ideas to address the challenges of our time. really our focus overlaps very much into the digital space, as we're thinking about, what would it mean for people, place and planet in terms of regenerative futures? What does it mean for education, how children grow up and feel they have agency to change the world, how this presents in lifelong learning through our Learning Society work, how it links to ensuring equality and opportunity in work for all, and how this has a place-based focus for people and communities. The RSA has a global fellowship of 30,000 change makers who are similarly focused on proactive problem solving in the communities where they are and the networks in which they operate. We have impact also through our platform. We host events, we convene, and we ensure that the maximum number of people can really access the information to make informed choices about the world. One thing that I'm very passionate about is our living change approach, and this is how we can take a collaborative approach to understanding the challenges of our time and work as entrepreneurs to take action to address them. And really importantly, this is very much linked to, go backwards. This is very much linked to ensuring that actually as we move forward as individuals, how we think about skills requires thinking differently. So how we bring in to address critical problems like digital exclusion, how we bring in systems thinking, future thinking, policy and convening, how we use our research and evidence base to advocate and influence, and how we ensure that participatory practice is a key route to change throughout. And this is just a few partners that the RSA is working with at the moment to make that change happen. I suppose the stage that we set today is really in relation to the recent Levelling Up white paper. And when Helen and I were thinking about today's talk, really, I think our reflections focused on the fact that whilst the Levelling Up paper does highlight some really critical issues and calls for action around addressing kind of hyperlocal disparities, not just between places, but within places, and the need for connectivity and skills for all, this really doesn't go far enough. So I suppose that sets the scene for, whilst the paper highlights these things, actually to ensure societal equality, we need to go much, much further. Just bringing it back to some fundamentals, therefore, access is multidimensional, and as Helen highlighted, in terms of how Good Things Foundation works, that means that ensuring that people both have devices, connectivity and data. If you like, that's the foundations, but on top of those, it's kind of therefore, how do you use these digital resources, the skills that ensure that across life and work, people are able to maximize opportunities. And critically, this third dimension of sometimes often described as motivation, but really what stops people going online, doing more, or staying narrow or limited users. I'll hand back to Helen.
So one of the things that we do annually at Good Things Foundation is that we try and get underneath the stats for digital exclusion and put them out there as a digital nation. So this is our Digital Nation 2021. I really think the graphic of the digital divide has stood the test of time. And although during the pandemic, we'll say a bit more about this later, is that the divide has narrowed, it has deepened. It's good to talk about the haves and the have-nots. And so on one side, we've got the 10 million people who lack the most basic digital skills, and the others on the other side, 86% of adults using the internet. But actually on the excluded side, what we're trying to show here is it's not binary. So that there's a group of the population that we call narrow users or limited users. So they're people who may have access, or they may have access some of the time, but actually they don't have those foundation skills, or they're people who have proxy users, so they're offline, but they have someone who uses the internet for them. And so these narrow users are incredibly important, because quite often they are the most invisible, and also they don't necessarily know that they don't have the skills that they need to function in today's society. So just the next slide goes down a bit deeper into some of those numbers, that 10 million people lack the most basic digital skills, 8.7 million lack basic digital skills for work, 2.6 million people are completely offline, so that means they never use the internet, they have zero skills, zero access. 2 million households struggle to afford the internet access, and 1.5 million have no internet access at home at all, be that mobile or fixed line. And I can see there's a question about the presentation. We're very happy to share the presentation afterwards, if that's helpful.
Okay, so I'll pick up there. So these kind of numbers speak to, I suppose, what we may have seen or put a light on during the pandemic, which was that these really mean that the impact upon people's economic situation, their ability to sustain and move into good work and well-paid jobs that fit their lifestyles, their opportunities with education, their contact and ability to continue connections, to participate, to be an active member of their community, the levels of kind of people's health, care, mental well-being, and also their financial situation. All of these domains were really heavily hit hard during the pandemic for people who were already maybe struggling to be online, to sustain that kind of activity online. And just to dive into that a bit more, if you don't have personal access, these are kind of the key things that come into play. So for a lot of people who lack personal access, and in March 2021, that was 6% of households, cost is a huge problem, and it's this interrelated problems around data poverty, and also during the pandemic, the highlight on lack of suitable devices that came to play if people were having to homeschool, to remote work, if you needed multiple devices. Even two-step verification has kind of shown that it's shutting out certain people who don't have that access to multiple devices. There's also an issue here around smartphone only use. And again, that plays into the kind of skills that different kinds of devices and different kinds of uses build. So following on to that, as Helen said, 2.6 million people are still offline. What's interesting is that we always are kind of, I suppose, the narrative is around that the offline population is predominantly older. However, we find that 10% of people offline are actually under 50, and that those people who are offline are also on very, very low incomes, and therefore in a very financially precarious position anyway. In terms of this, a kind of further 20.5 million adults have very low digital engagement. So that means that there are people who are doing a very limited range of activities online, and during the pandemic, obviously that became increasingly challenging as many services pivoted to a digital first model. In terms of lack of motivation, key reasons for people not having access are always cited by people saying it's too complicated, they're not interested, or they don't feel it's needed, or it's too expensive. And what's interesting about these statements is that it hides a plethora of actual kind of lack of social and other resources to be able to access the support, to ask the right questions about where to go, what they need to do and how they need to use it. What we have seen over recent years is that internet security related concerns have significantly increased. And the RSA actually released a report today around this in relation to cashless, the growth and move towards cashless societies. And that internet security actually is a huge concern for people when they're thinking about that move. I'll pass back to Helen. You're on mute, Helen.
I know, I had to do it one time, didn't I? Clearly all of you will be aware that obviously being digitally excluded means you can't carry out an internet search, you can't communicate with family and friends, you can't fill in online forms, you can't order food, medicines online, and you cannot apply for work or carry out basic online tasks, nor indeed apply for basic benefits. So who has a stake in fixing the digital divide? So it's absolutely cross-sectoral. So government, both central, regional and local. Digital exclusion holds policy back from being successfully implemented. And I think this is still a massive lack of understanding in those areas. You know, quite often when I'm talking to regional, local government, they'll be saying, oh, our digital person, the person who looks after digital will talk to you, rather than health, housing, social care, looked after children, family integration. So it's absolutely about social policy, not just about transactions. That we know that public services, though, are used most by people who are most socially excluded, and there's this massive overlap by people who are socially excluded and who are also digitally excluded. And we know that from our research working with the Centre for Economic and Business Research, investment in digital inclusion does boost the economy by almost £15 for every £1 invested. And big news is that the work that we're doing CBR, that was the latest figures from 2018, and we're publishing a 2022 report in May. So do look out for that, because that's going to be very interesting to see the impact of the pandemic. Obviously, corporates have a role to play, both looking after their current customers, their future customers. Many of them have digitized a lot of their services and therefore make profit from that internet expansion. But it's also true that corporates are interested in ESG and CSR, and are willing to make investments to help them with their triple bottom line, with their social responsibility or their environmental, social and governance responsibilities. So with charities, during the pandemic, a lot of charities actually digitized their services at pace, including housing associations, but many, many, many other charities too. For them, that they weren't really thinking about digital exclusion or talking about digital exclusion until they were aware that they had no way of actually delivering some of their services without those beneficiaries being able to use the internet. As with public services, the people who are highest users of charity services are also most likely to be digitally excluded because of that overlap between social exclusion and digital exclusion. And then obviously organisations like ourselves and others work with those local charities and community organisations who do reach and support and embed digital inclusion into that work locally. So one of the areas in which government has supported, so the government supported us for 7 years, us at Good Things Foundation, with a future digital inclusion programme, helping adults to learn essential digital skills. And although we aren't able to publish the full research, this actually gives you a snapshot of some of the work through the progression surveys that we were able to do over those 7 years. So big numbers here around people who went on to further learning or qualifications-based learning, employment-related activities, so 80% is huge. But 20% of the people that were supported through this basic digital skills program went on to get full or part-time work. So although 20% isn't a huge number, that is 150,000 people looking at that 1.5 million. And that this is not an employment program, right? So this is a skills program. And I think my point there is actually looking at digital exclusion and enabling people, in a levelling up language, we could say enabling people to feel part of society, feel included in society, as well as having the skills and the devices that they need to be able to take part, is so, so important across a whole range of policy areas. So the next slide is about the pandemic. So the pandemic has made a big difference So we know that there was about 1 million people who have improved their digital skills, who were narrow users from the essential digital skills, so the EDS, so the essential digital skills framework, the research that Lloyd's do. So 1 million people moved from having some of those to having all of those during the pandemic. So another example of people who have a little and then actually were able to, through use, to be boosted and further on. But then actually the motivation point that Al was talking about earlier, so 48% of people in 2020 said that nothing would encourage them to get online, and that's only 32% in 2021. But the really big one, which is huge for us at Good Things Foundation, is that in 2020, only 5% of people said that local support would be the easiest way to learn new digital skills. But in 2021, 35%, and that is actually about those people who are now motivated to learn the skills. So actually their awareness in themselves of the relevance of the internet has gone up, and therefore now they're looking and wanting local skills, local support. So the pandemic has, of course, affected all of us. It's had huge tragedies and huge loss of lives. It's changed society and it's changed us. We know that in that first lockdown period that there were many, many organisations who were saying that they were digitising their services in 3 weeks, in 3 months, that they would have done in 3 years or in 5 years. But for digital exclusion, it massively exposed and exacerbated the digital divide. So in a good way, that meant that something that actually, as Becky said earlier, that I've been working in this field for a very long time, that actually people understood it. Like people who were working from home, who were ordering their groceries from home, who were connected to loved ones over the internet, all of a sudden became aware, well, what if I had to do this and I didn't have that access and those skills? It's also brought in new supporters, notably from business. I mentioned Virgin Media O2, who is a big supporter for digital inclusion and Good Things Foundation now, who have become aware that some of the things that they started as emergency activities or emergency support, actually, it wasn't the pandemic that created that digital divide. Actually, the pandemic just exposed it and exacerbated it. And others have actually reduced or changed their support, and notably government. So I mentioned the Future Digital Inclusion Programme, that finished in the middle of the pandemic. And so that investment in adults to get those essential digital skills actually is now over. So at the very time that the digital divide, it was becoming more apparent, it was also the time when that government support went away. I've put "and changed" because, of course, you'll know that the DFE spent a lot of money providing more than 1 million devices to children to help them with their homeschooling, but we still know that there's 30% of children in households with a household income of less than £20,000 a year, 30% of them do not have access to an internet connected device. So we still have a massive inequality around digital inclusion in this country. So at Good Things Foundation, our response has definitely broadened and deepened. Again, like others, we very much became aware of things that we weren't aware of before. And one of those things is data poverty. So, 2 years ago, we were setting up and we were delivering a program with Future.now to actually get devices and mobile data into the hands of people as an emergency response. Because that network, that amazing network of thousands of community organizations that we work with, when their doors were closed, those people who they had been supported still needed support, and many of them were offline. And many of those people that were supported during the pandemic, thousands of them had never used the internet before, but by providing them with a device with mobile connectivity and with support from community organizations, they got online for the first time and they were supported to do that remotely, which was amazing. On data poverty became a very big deal, that if you have a device, you need to connect it to the internet. And data poverty makes the work that we do interact much more closely with poverty, because we're now working with people, not just those people who are digitally excluded because of a range of social challenges, but actually we are now working with people who their only challenge is they have no money, so they cannot afford a £10 top up for their phone. So with Nominet, we created a data poverty lab to collaborate, coordinate and amplify. And we've done a number of things, but one of the things that we're currently doing is we've created 3 fellowships, one looking at place-based pioneers, so what are the community-led solutions to data poverty? How do we talk about data and data poverty? And should the internet be viewed as an essential utility or a human right, or, as I always say, or something else, because this is a fellowship, people are able to have their own idea. And then one of the things that came out of the data poverty lab quite quickly, so last summer we with Virgin Media O2 created a national data bank. So that's like a food bank but for mobile data, and we've scaled that with Virgin Media O2, with Vodafone and 3 for 500,000 SIMs to be able to support over 350,000 people over 2 years. So I showed you this at the beginning of the talk, that so for Good Things Foundation, what we've always done is about working with those hyperlocal organizations to reach, engage, motivate, as well as provide skill support to people at that hyperlocal level. But during the pandemic, because many of those people who didn't have access to the internet before were actually invisible, because they were getting access through those community organizations, or from sitting outside McDonald's, or from going to a library. Actually, they no longer had access. And if we are about, which we are at Good Things Foundation, and if we are about leveling up and digital equality, then actually we need people to have their own personal access to the internet. It's not okay just to be able to have a 1-hour session that you can book at the library. You should have your own device, and you should be able to afford access to the internet. So that's why we've created the National Data Bank and the National Device Bank that is being delivered through that digital inclusion network. So thanks very much, and I'll pass back to Al.
So I suppose we wanted to leave you with some takeaways. I suppose coming back to you need access, you also need inclusion, and you need support. So really personal access, as Helen said, digital becoming a universal need meant that we saw that digital exclusion is much more than being offline. So you need access to suitable devices, maybe multiple devices, and data poverty must be addressed as is being done so by the great work of Good Things Foundation. It's also ensuring that no one is left behind. So the light that's been shone during COVID-19 and the various lockdowns exposed people who were already struggling and digitally excluded. If we can see those gaps, we need to make sure that we're working harder than ever to close the digital divide. It's critical that this kind of support is place-based, hyperlocal, and it's really about that kind of community innovation. What we saw, and very much so through all the time, I also was at Good Things Foundation, community partners on the front line have always responded to the needs of people in their communities, and they did so with speed, compassion and intelligence during the crisis. But what we need to ensure is that there is financial support for these local level ecosystems in order for digital inclusion to be future-proof. Needs do change, they're evolving all the time, but without that kind of community support, there will be people who move further and further away from inclusion. And in terms of practice and policy, this is not about creating silos or creating a separate way in which digital inclusion is thought about. It needs to be embedded into all local services. And there needs to be real effort about addressing some of those challenges around motivation, ensuring that we promote the benefits of the internet for all people, not as talking to people, but working with them. It's critical that we provide essential free digital skill support, and that we prioritise those people who are actually struggling and in poverty. We know that funding holistic approaches that meet wider needs, so that language isn't a barrier, and that accessibility isn't a reason for people not to be included. So that's really, really critical. Investment needs to go into holistic support. It's critical that we continue to harness the power of peers, and that's both within the workplace and communities, in kind of informal learning settings, because we know and we have the evidence that this is a key asset in terms of building skills and motivation. There is a real responsibility for organisations and for employers to support basic digital skills, prioritising their low-skilled staff and giving that opportunity to level up within organisations. And also to be able to use digital inclusion as a catalyst to grow local networks and collaborations to strengthen the systems and ecosystems that are there to ensure that these divides don't continue to grow. We've just included, and we'll share these slides, some links to work that we've referenced in this presentation that might be useful. And that's it from us. So I'll hand back for questions.
Was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much, Helen and Al. I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege and just make a few comments, and I've got a couple of questions lined up, but please do pop your questions into the chat. Just to make the point that you talked early on about limited, what the term about limited users of the internet, and we've actually just do a quick plug that we've just published a blog today, a data commentary on the Digit website about the fact that these limited users aren't counted in digital exclusion statistics, so they're being missed out often from the kind of dialogue. So people who are dependent on proxy users, people who only have limited mobile only access, for example, and the importance of actually how do we go about counting these users and some approaches. And so just a reflection for those of us who've been working in the kind of digital inclusion research space, the pandemic was a bit of a kind of moment in the sun where actually people really kind of woke up and realised the extent of this problem. And when we interviewed NGOs and organisations supporting job seekers during the pandemic, they often didn't realise the extent of the challenges people were facing, but they were also concerned about the people who were being completely left behind. So when we spoke to these organisations, there was a sense that actually the pandemic meant that people were completely left behind. And those concerns about, I thought Helen described it really brilliantly about it's the digital divides have got narrower, but it's also got deeper. And just also about that point about financial support for kind of local level ecosystems, organisations are often talking about there's a kind of patchwork of funding. So in some areas, there's a really kind of strong digital inclusion kind of ecosystem, but still you have the issue where that's a real patchwork of issues, and that organisations find it really difficult to access meaningful kind of sustained funding for digital inclusion work, and that funders are kind of really wary in supporting sort of the purchase of technology and so on and so forth. And all of this is obviously taking place against the backdrop of austerity, which is still biting at a local level. So do we have any questions yet? One thing I'm just going to kick off with one question, and then I'm going to bring in Asha to ask a question. So do you think the pandemic, so we were just talking about the fact that it kind of raised awareness of digital exclusion, has it changed enough? So one thing that concerns me is actually I read an EU document recently that was saying, oh, it's brilliant because the pandemic has kind of forced everybody online. Do you think there is a danger of complacency? And do you think, how can we carry on ensuring that we have this kind of continued support for digital exclusion projects? That's a question for both of you, and then we'll come to Asha after that.
Do you want me to kick off? I mean, I think, Becky, that I feel both optimistic and pessimistic, right? I think we're still riding a wave of increased awareness. So I definitely think around corporate customers, I mean, corporates working with us and wanting to work with us as partners, that's true. I think that we definitely have learnt how to do new things. And so that that definitely with our community partners, some of them are still delivering remote support to people who they hadn't reached before. So people who are homebound, for example, people in rural areas, people who have 2 jobs and couldn't get to a local physical place 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So that flexibility around supporting people in their own home. So that innovation, I think, definitely has been positive. I think on the central government side, I think that there are more departments who are doing small things. So, for example, DWP have recognised that you can't job search without being on the internet, right? So actually, if you've got the right job coach, then they can actually support you with your broadband costs. But like I said, you know, the Job Centre Plus and the DWP tentacles go very large out. So there are all the positive things. On the negative side, I think it's really unbelievable that all the innovation in school-age children education that's gone on seemed to be completely forgotten. Like, all the kids are now back in the classroom, and all of that innovation that people have done has kind of gone by the wayside. So you know, I've been, you know, working in education and the internet for 30 years, and you know, some of the stuff that was happening during the pandemic, I was like, oh, thank God, finally, and then poof, it's all gone again, right? So, and then my worry is that actually it's not that people won't know that digital exclusion exists. I think it will just become less interesting, right? So that people's awareness has been raised, their knowledge has been raised, but actually they'll just move on to something else. And so it's more that when it's not in their face, when they've got children at home and they know that they've got friends who can't access the internet, and they know that there are adults who are near them who are trying to do a job working from home on a smartphone, it's like those memories will fade, and I think that if that fades quickly, then I think we're in a difficult situation.
Absolutely. Al, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think also the thing that we've always said about digital inclusion is it's a lifelong journey, and I think there was something where we saw, you know, obviously more people became motivated by default to be online, but weren't necessarily doing a lot of different things online. And so I think there's still a kind of challenge around, is being online enough, and does that meet all your needs if digital services continue to accelerate and actually we're not able to support people with lifelong learning to actually kind of say, well, actually now you have to negotiate this and this, and therefore I think that whole narrative around support being absolutely critical is still, and you know, the most important thing, because we are in an ever-changing world, and without that, for some people it is hard to kind of move and to be resilient. So I think there is a danger around that, you know, being online during the pandemic does not necessarily mean that you're socially and digitally included for life.
Absolutely. Asha, did you have a question?
I do, yes. Nice to see you, Becky, and thank you. And thank you, Ali, Al and Helen. It was an excellent presentation. I suspect you're talking to the converted to some extent, and yet I think we are still, well, speaking for myself, I was shocked by the I'm a lecturer at the other place, the University of Brighton down the road. And I think I and colleagues were shocked by how many students during the pandemic were attending Microsoft Teams seminars using their mobile phones, not because they couldn't be bothered to use other technology, but that was the reality of their lived home experience. Especially we have a significant sort of commuter body of students of colour from London, for example. Some of the responses that you both made to Becky's point raised the kind of things I wanted to talk about, which is to do with education, what we've learned about education, and how that's still something that's changing fast. So our university's gone back entirely to face-to-face teaching as a brand differentiator, that we are a place in a place where people come to study, but all the kind of learning we got out of actually running sometimes very successful Microsoft Teams collaborative work environments and things like that. So how can we hold on to the learning we've got? And then, Ali, your final point, I'm afraid I was going sort of down that line. Meetings in Meta, they're going to be a thing. It's not enough to just think about what Daniel Miller, I think, called how the world changed social media. It's like, it's beyond just what we can do on our phone screen. So some thoughts about what next and how to keep it going. And I know there's no easy answers.
I'm going to make one quick response to that, is that I think whatever innovations that we come across, these issues around digital poverty and data poverty, keeping an eye on that, because if you think about the bandwidth required for a meeting in Meta, what does that require? It probably requires like your entire phone sort of data allowance. So thinking about integrating digital into our learning, which I think is really important, and we did just innovate on the hoof brilliantly, colleagues, pat on the back for all of us during the pandemic, but thinking about the those kind of hidden disadvantage that can kind of present itself in that education access. So Helen and Al, any thoughts on the future of digital inclusion in education?
Go first, Al. Yeah.
I think one of the positive things is now that I hear people mentioning that in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. So I think it has actually shown that this is a key consideration and dimension. I think the challenge is that, as you say, that people quickly lose the nuance of what that means in terms of also continuing to support and upskill people, and people feeling able to say, I can't do that, I don't know how to do that, or I'm not able to do that because of device connectivity, data. So there's something here which is a wider, I suppose, point around how do we make it easier to say that, because actually that has always been a real challenge in terms of people's reasons for not being online. So just the assumption now that we can go back, but we don't actually really ask the questions of what people can easily do, and have we ensured that that kind of investment is there in an ongoing way, so that we navigate all these changes, because we will continue, and the digital innovation that is there is really positive, but only if it comes with ongoing support throughout. But Helen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we turn the question round, I think part of the reason why that education has gone back to face is because of the institutionalization of education, right? Is that education, I mean, dare I say it, is not created in the best way for learners. It's created in the best way for scaled institutions to deliver at scale, and with economic models that are around a certain kind of delivery model. So actually, that what the pandemic provided was an opportunity to disrupt those systemic errors, if you like, that were already in place within our education system, and actually enable innovation to happen, to work around those, and to work what would now be perceived as working against them, right? And so it's the question is not like, do we know what good learning looks like, and do we know how the internet can support good learning? Actually, the question is, how do we change our institutions so that they actually respond to the best kind of learning and teaching, and where technology can be part of that? I live in Sheffield, and the number of new buildings that the universities of Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam have created is completely based on an economic model which is pre-pandemic. And I was in Sheffield thinking, oh my, like they will have thought that they've made this huge error, that they that they've built all these buildings, but no, of course they don't, because they're just bringing students back into the buildings. The other thing though that I thought was interesting during the pandemic were, so this is higher education students, were saying that actually they wanted some fees back because they weren't going to face-to-face interactions. And all of my friends who are university lecturers were working their socks off, providing really good quality learning and teaching, and actually potentially better than what the students were getting face-to-face. So actually, you know, that paradigm between the student and the institution and the people providing the teaching and learning. So, you know, I think that we have to ask ourselves, I just want to say one thing on data poverty, because the work that we're doing within the data poverty lab and potentially the question around should the internet be a utility or a human right actually begins to talk about, so what are the systemic problems we've got within within data poverty, as an example, because of course data poverty is driven by poverty, but you know, I'm aware that we're not going to fix that overnight, but actually all of the models that we're coming up with is how do we create how do we enable people to have free access to the internet when they can't afford it, which is absolutely right, is what we all should be doing. How can we create different solutions to make the internet more affordable and more and access to it more affordable? But actually we're not really going back to first principles to say how can we actually make the internet affordable for everybody as a basic, in the way that we have water in our homes, that you know that when you move into a new house, the only thing that's really switched on, if you haven't organized it, is the water. Is the internet now like water? And if we're saying, if DWP is saying you can't apply for benefits, you can't claim benefits, you can't look for work without the internet, if schools are saying you can't really have the best quality education from us as a school if you don't have the internet, surely we should be asking more challenging questions. I absolutely, as a charity, believe we should work hard to give people access to free internet where we can, but actually we should be asking more bigger systemic questions about what's the role of the internet and how should that be, who should subsidize it, and who should pay for that.
Absolutely. This message in the chat about how much we love that kind of analogy about the internet as water. So there's a question in the chat, which is, what impact do you think there may be for previously digitally excluded individuals and families when they do eventually get skilled up and accesses to device and Wi-Fi? We got some money from the university last year to provide basic tablet computers to people. And one of the notable things is that people often use devices to help other people. They use their devices not necessarily to find jobs or go on Facebook. They use them to support the communities they work with, to support the communities they're part of, to connect with people. So what impact do you think there might be for previously digitally excluded individuals and families? Do you think sometimes all these debates are driven by kind of productivity and access to work, when it's actually more about we should be thinking more holistically? Al's nodding, so maybe she wants to go first.
Absolutely, and I think that growth in social capital and the opportunity to be kind of someone who not only is looking for support, but who, and it comes back to, I suppose, also what we highlighted in terms of the importance of peer-to-peer approaches and the embedding of that. I think people who have gone on that journey, who can then now access and have personal access easily, suddenly it's a switch is thrown, and actually also seeing people who, you know, and we've always had this with our community partners, seeing people who then they relate to, well, I was there 6 months ago and I know how hard that is. But actually it's a huge leveler in it, being able to talk from lived experience perspective, rather than someone saying you should go online because you need to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that actually that growth of social capital, both in terms of peer-to-peer impacts and outcomes, but also for your community, and also how you then can have a voice about issues where you have seen, you know, you've seen personal impact where those underlying issues have been addressed. So absolutely critical. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add to that is that the question there about always on is that I think one of the things that we often say is about thinking about what your life is like in the offline world, and how and though the internet will bring benefits, but also all of the things that you have, you know, being streetwise, being careful, you know, not leaving your purse on your, you know, on the fence outside your front door, you know, actually bringing your knowledge and experience as adults living in a world, actually bringing that to the online world. And that means turning it off and having a conversation with your family as well. So it's actually is that rather than thinking that you have to do everything is changed, is actually thinking about your use of the internet as being an enabler to do things better and quicker, as well as some new things, but also making sure that you're aware that you are already a whole person that does keep yourself safe, keep your family safe, does communicate with other people in the offline world, and bring all of that confidence and self-esteem about your ability to function in a society just into the digital society.
I know when you talk to digital champions about how they work to get people online, it's often like, talk to somebody about their interests, whether it's fishing or playing the bassoon, and get them to go and look at some YouTube videos rather than saying, go out and get a job or whatever. Jackie's got her hand up.
Hi, thank you very much. That was great. I've got loads of questions, but I just wanted to ask, maybe reduce it to two. I mean, first of all, I think you're doing great work. Obviously, that's why I wanted to invite you to find out more about it. I mean, I mentioned, and it links on to a point raised earlier about as the digital connections get spread out, eventually a very large majority will have them. So if we think about longer term research and policy agendas, will the question be about the quality of those connections in the same way we think about employment? So we've extended the number of people who are in the labour market, but the key issue is about the quality of that work and as we've seen with P&O, the protection or security those people have. So I'm trying to think in that sense of how the agenda will develop. And the second question I have is about, do you think there'll be the development of some digital identity cards? Because, for example, there are lots of people who, if they don't have a passport or a driving license, they can't get online, even if they had a computer, or to register for these things. So will there be a policy, you think, to come out to enable people to have some kind of identity card like that, much as there is a long tradition of resistance to that in the UK? And I'm going to ask one last third question here, because I can't help myself. Who do you think is doing it better than us?
We've got 6 minutes left.
Shall we take them one by one? Just think on the identity card is, I don't think we're going to have an identity card as such, because I think that what we'll have is we'll continue to use the sorts of things that we have now. So we have, you know, credit card numbers, we have national insurance numbers, and so, you know, there are already people who don't have those things, who are already at a disadvantage from an identity point of view. So I think that's one I'm just going to answer quickly and kind of place it. I think the on the quality of connections is that there's actually a bit of debate going on around meaningful use of the internet. So, and I think that's a little bit behind your question there, Jackie, is that I mean, quite often when we talk about narrow users, we talk about young people who have smartphones but only ever use social media. Like, that's a good thing because it helps them to have communication with other people. We've helped a woman in the West Midlands who was a victim of modern slavery, and actually she uses social media to stay alive, you know, to stop her from killing herself. So actually, you know, those things can sometimes seem like they're not meaningful, but I think making sure that we're understanding how the internet can benefit life, and how we can make sure, and actually bring it back to levelling up, that those benefits and those opportunities are equalised. you know, that actually for me, that I was hoping a lot more from the Levelling Up white paper, that actually, for example, enabling people to work from anywhere in the country. However, we still know that because of the inherent inequalities around educational attainment, much social mobility is set in at birth, if not at primary and secondary school. So that actually you know, seeing the benefits that the internet can bring in that way. But I'll pass over to Al, and then maybe we can come back to the who's doing it better than us.
Yeah, I think the quality of connections is a really interesting question, where actually we know that you know, those connections can be the reason that, as Helen says, you know, that people are able to find work, to sustain relationships, and obviously a lot of that relies now on having that kind of digital presence and also ability to navigate that. I think there is something really interesting about how we live with this and balance it with kind of actually the need that people have had post-pandemic to reconnect outside of a digital space. So how do we, where people feel really nervous about doing things face-to-face and not online anymore, how do we rebuild some of this trust to actually ensure that some of the offline behaviours that people have also translate into positive online behaviours as well? And not seeing these as two separate tracks. I think in terms of digital identity, I know that, for example, a number of different government departments like DWP have been looking at this for a long time, because there is a real need with people who obviously need to access various government services, and probably are the people who need to access them most, that this is where the challenge presents. So I think I would agree with Helen that we're not moving to digital identity cards, but what I would see is different ways for people to be able to, and again, it comes back to a greater equality point, to be able to actually access what they need without actually having the lack of access to other things as a barrier. So how I know that is an ongoing discussion for various government departments. How do you address that as an ongoing area of inequality? And then who does it best and better? Well, for a long time, the work in the UK, I would say, has been world leading. But I think what's interesting now is thinking also about the context-driven innovation that happens globally. That we're not aware of, the kind of workarounds, the ways in which actually you can still be connected, you can access the internet with very limited resources and means, and actually looking to that, and also the way in which this not just being a thing where it's just about a personal access, but actually what do we look at that next level up, those kind of connections at a community level, and how does that work? So I'm very interested in that, because there are great examples of that from all over the world. Helen, I'll pass back to you.
So I think from a activity input point of view, the UK is definitely leading the way. I would though throw a challenge back to you, because you're the researchers, and I think this would be a lovely research question, is what are the conditions that create digital exclusion, right? Because it's not just that you don't have a computer and you don't have affordable internet and you don't have skills. So Scandinavia is always top of the pile for everything. Today, I even read they're top of the pile with the lowest e-waste in Europe, right? So what are the conditions in Scandinavia that create low levels of digital exclusion, low levels of e-waste? And I think we know they're kind of top of the pile in other ways as well. So I think it's back to that point, is that we're very much around what are the solutions that we can create to try and eradicate digital exclusion. I think we're definitely leaders, world leaders in the UK, but actually thinking more fundamentally, what are the conditions that drive that exclusion in the first place? I think that would be a really, really interesting topic to explore further.
Thank you so much. And that's a great way to end this discussion today, with a rousing call for what sounds like some fascinating research. I'll take it on. I'm happy to do it. Thank you so much to Helen Milner from the Good Things Foundation, Al Mathers from the RSA. It's been an absolutely brilliant event, and thanks to all for attending. Bye. Thank you very much.